Hey nerdy knitters, if you're new to lace knitting and you'd like to start with some simple projects, I have the perfect project for you today. We're going to do a very simple classic lace design that only uses 2 different stitches besides your knits and purls to create the pattern. Before we dive in, let me just say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. Let's start by looking at what you're going to need to complete this dish towel. You're going to need some dish towel yarn. I used Picks Dishie. 1 skein is 190 yards, and it's enough to complete the small size. If you want to make the large size, you'll need 2 skeins. If you're using a different yarn, you'll have to check the yardage. But I really like Picks Dishie. It's really soft but very absorbent. It's 100% cotton, so it's perfect for a dish towel. You'll also need your knitting needles. We're using US 8 or 5mm. I use circular needles for everything, but you're free to use straight needles as well. Tapestry needle to weave in ends, and a few stitch markers to separate the edge stitches from each of the pattern repeats. And of course, you'll also need your pattern. You can find the link for downloading that down below in the video description box. Now, for those who are new to patterns, let's just run through the pattern really quickly so you know exactly what you'll find here. We start by looking at the sizes. This pattern includes 2 sizes, a small and a large. Small is by itself, and then the next size is in parentheses. So you'll see that all through the pattern as we're working through. The small size will be by itself, and then everything that pertains to the larger size will be in parentheses or brackets. As you can see right here, our next thing is finished measurements. And we start by looking at just the inches. There's the small size, and then in parentheses we have the large size. And then in brackets, we have those same measurements in centimeters. And then we have our list of materials, which we've just gone through. Your dishcloth yarn, the yarn I used, and the approximate yardage you'll need if you're using a different type of yarn, the needles, and then the notions as well down here. And then we also have our gauge measurements, stitches and rows in the lace pattern. It's a dish towel, so I don't think you have to be as concerned about gauge, but if you want to work a swatch, that is the gauge I had for the final project. Then you'll have a few notes here, how you can add or subtract stitches if you want to change the size of the towel, the difficulty level, which just tells you what sort of things are included so you'll know if it's a pattern that you're ready to tackle depending on your skill level. The abbreviations used in the pattern are all right here, and the special techniques, we have 1 double decrease, and it's explained right here. And then we get into the instructions themselves, which we'll go through as we work the dish towel, and we finish with the stitch pattern and the chart, and we will practice reading those just in a little bit. But let's start with casting on for our dish towel. Use any cast on you want. I'm going to use the long tail cast on. I start without a slip knot. I have the tail of the yarn over my thumb, and I'm holding the yarn that's attached to the ball in my fingers, so it sort of makes a slingshot. And I just go like this, and I skip the slip knot. That's my first stitch. Then I can start casting on. So you're free to use whatever cast on you like. I just prefer this cast on. And we're going to work 5 rows of garter stitch, but we're going to slip this first stitch. We're going to bring the yarn to the front, insert like we're going to purl a stitch, and just slip that stitch. Then take the yarn to the back. And that first one's a little loose from our cast on. Take the yarn to the back and just knit across those stitches. And you're going to repeat this 5 times. So you'll have a few ridges of garter stitch. And what's happening when you're slipping that stitch, it forms this little chain across the edge. So it's just a nice finished edge, and it provides a bit of stretch along that edge too. Where this is a lace dish towel, you might want to stretch it out to show off that lace, and you want your edge to stretch as well. So we slip it purlwise to create that pretty chain. Once you finish that initial garter stitch edge, we're going to do a setup row. We're still going to work in garter stitch, but we're going to place some markers so we're ready to work our lace pattern. So we'll start like we always do, slipping that stitch purlwise, knit 2. You're going to place a marker. I like to use different colors for my edge stitches from the ones that will be used to differentiate the different lace repeats, but you can use whatever stitch markers you like. Then you're going to purl 1. This is our balancing stitch. I'll explain that more when we look at our lace pattern. And then the repeat is purl 10, place a marker. So you're going to do that across the row. There's my first 10 plus 1, so I've got 11 in this first section. Place my marker and then repeat that. Purl 10, place a marker. You'll repeat that for all of your lace repeats. I'm just doing a smaller portion here, so I'm only going to do the lace twice. Place your final marker and knit 3. So now we've set up for our lace. So at this point, you'll have your garter stitch, you'll have your edge stitches, 3 stitches on each side that you'll continue to work in garter stitch, slipping that first stitch and then knitting the other stitches. And then in the markers in here, you'll have your lace. You'll have more repeats. If you do the small dish towel, you'll have 4 sections of lace. If you do the large towel, you'll have 6 repeats of that pattern. But I am going to just do 2 repeats here. So you'll have markers separating each repeat, just so you can see where you are in your pattern. It's just a little easier if you're new to lace knitting. And that final section, you'll have 10 stitches between each one, but in the final one, you'll have 11 stitches because we need 1 stitch to balance the pattern. Now that we've cast on, worked our border, set our stitch markers in place so we're ready to work that lace, let's look at how to read a lace chart. I talked about that 1 stitch to balance the pattern. That's this stitch right here. You can see this red box. This is our pattern repeat. However many repeats you're working across the row. In our dish towel here, we have 4 repeats. You can see that lace is repeated 4 times. So we did what was in the box 4 times for this pattern. So this red box shows you that repeat that you're working across the row. And then 1 stitch at the edge to balance. And what that means is you want both sides to horizontally look the same. We start with a column of knit stitches here, and then we've got our yarn overs. And if we finished right there with a yarn over, it wouldn't be balanced. You can see that the pattern would be off. So to finish on the other edge, we want to balance it, so we include that balancing stitch. So if you see a pattern, this one would be 10 stitches plus 1. 10 stitches in our repeat plus 1 stitch. So whenever you see that for a pattern, that's what that means. It's telling you how many stitches are in the repeat and then how many stitches to balance the pattern horizontally, so each of those sides look the same. And then we only have 2 stitches going on here besides our knit and our purl. We're working in stockinette, so that means these blank boxes we're knitting on the right side of the work, and when we're on the wrong side of the work, we are purling across that row. So our wrong sides are pretty easy. We're just going to purl back across the row. On the right sides, we're going to knit, we're going to work some yarn overs, and we're going to work an SK2P, or it's sometimes called slip 1, knit 2, PSSO, which means pass, slip, stitch over. I'll show you exactly how to work that. So I prefer to work from a chart, but you might prefer written instructions, and those are right here. There you can see the multiple of 10 stitches plus 1, and then we have our instructions here. Knit 1, yarn over, knit 3, SK2P, knit 3, yarn over, and then it's telling us there's our semicolon repeat from that asterisk. So knit 1 again, and you repeat this again. So the asterisks represent that box, that red box you see right there. That's what those asterisks represent in the written instructions. It's the same thing, just of course you can't put a red box around it on there. And then you'd work that to your final stitch, and then you knit 1. Row 2 in all the wrong side rows, you're going to purl, and then those instructions are repeated, and they're exactly the same as what is written right here. You have your repeat symbol, that's what you're going to work, and then you get to your semicolon and you're going to go back and repeat that again for the next 10 stitches, repeat again for the next 10 stitches until you've worked across all of those center stitches till the final stitch, and you'll knit 1. Now the thing to note right here, there's no reference to those edge stitches. This is only talking about what's happening between these 2 edge markers. This is often what you'll see when you see a knitting pattern. You'll have your stitch patterns on their own page, but it's not referring to the whole project. It's only referring to certain sections of the project. So for our dish towel, it's referring to the stitches between these markers. It's not telling us what to do with these stitches. Now we would look at our pattern to tell us how to work that. we have the instructions for the actual dish towel. It's not the same as the stitch pattern instructions on the other side. Now, our first row tells us to slip one with yarn in front. We're going to maintain this the whole time. Knit two, slip that marker, and then it says work row 1 of horseshoe lace across those stitches. It tells you how many stitches you're going to work it across. My sample is a little different. And then you'll slip that final marker and knit 3. So the pattern is telling us how to work that stitch pattern plus what to do with those other stitches, what we're supposed to do with our edge stitches. All right, so we've worked those first 3, and now we're going to work row 1 of the horseshoe lace. Okay, so row 1 of the lace pattern is knit 1, yarn over. If you don't know how to work a yarn over, you take the yarn between the 2 needles up and around your right hand needle and hold it to the back and knit the next stitch, and you've increased a stitch. You've created a yarn over that has a hole underneath, and that's what gives us those decorative designs in lace patterns. Knit 2 more, and now we have that funny symbol, the SK2P. So to work that, you have to understand what all of those letters mean. S means slip, K means knit, P means pass the stitch over. So S, there's no number after it, so we're just going to slip 1 stitch, and in a decrease we slip as if to knit. So insert like you're going to knit a stitch, slip it, and then it says K2. When a number is after it, it's telling you how many stitches are involved. K2 means knit 2, so we knit them together as 1 stitch, and the P is pass that stitch over, that stitch that we slipped, we pass it over. That is an SK2P. We took 3 stitches and we turned them into 1 stitch, so it's a double decrease. And then we have knit 3, which brings us to our marker. Oh, and you can see this sometimes happens depending on your markers. Mine is stuck on that stitch, so I'm just gonna pull it over, out of the way. There's my final stitch, and then I have a yarn over. You want to be careful of the yarn overs on this first row because they're beside your markers and you don't want them to slip around. So I created my yarn over, I slipped my stitch, and now I'm at the end of that red line. So I'm going to go back over here and repeat that again. Yarn over, and then you're wondering, why is there an extra stitch right here? I'm at the end of my row. I just have my edge stitches left. That's that balancing stitch right at the end. So there's an extra stitch in your final repeat. Slip that marker. So we finished this. We can go back to our written instructions, work our horseshoe lace, and then slip marker and knit 3. And that is our first row of our lace pattern. Our row 2 tells us slip that first stitch. We're going to maintain those edge stitches. Slip, knit 2, slip the marker, and then purl to final marker and knit 3. Now that we've set up our lace pattern and you're confident in your chart reading abilities, you can start knitting this lace chart, but you might run into a problem. So we're going to quickly discuss some of the issues you might have while you're knitting. But what I like to do on wrong side rows when I'm working lace is to check and make sure I haven't forgotten a yarn over. So I know I'm going to have 2 yarn overs near the markers on each edge. So I'll just keep an eye out for those and make sure they're there. There's the first one. And there's that next one. We're going backwards, so we know we've got one over here near this marker. And there's that yarn over near the marker, so we want to be careful to keep that in the right place. So I'm going to work another row and I'm going to forget a yarn over, and I'll show you how you can correct that on the wrong side row without having to tink back your work to add that yarn over in. So I've worked row 3 and now I'm working row 4, the wrong side row. I'm going to check to make sure I haven't missed any yarn overs. There should be 2 in each section. There's the first one. There's my double decrease coming up right here. Right there, you can see the double decrease has 2 strands of yarn around the stitch, that heads of the stitch right there. There's 2 of them. Okay, and I can see I am missing yarn over somewhere. There should have been one right here. So I can look at my pattern. This is the row I finished. So it should be that double decrease, there was one already. I'm working back this way. So there should be 2 stitches after the decrease and then a yarn over. So I can go back here and look and turn it around if I have to. And you can see the double decrease. That's got that slanting yarn. It slants off to the left. So there's the 2 stitches. Oh, my yarn over should be right here. And I don't have one. So what can I do? Do I have to rip out my work and go do that, add that yarn over? You don't have to if you catch it on the very next row. You can do, basically it's a make one. If you know how to do a make one increase, it's the same thing. There's the stitch that's on my left needle. If I follow that yarn that's in that stitch that I just finished working, the yarn that connects them is right here. And that's where that yarn over should have been. So all I have to do is pop it up onto my needle, but I want it to lean in that direction. I want the stitch sort of to slant off to the left. So if I turn my work and look around, I can give it a little tug. It looks like I just put a yarn over there. And I did. It wasn't on the row that I worked, but I can sneak it back in there. Now it might be a little smaller than the other yarn overs, but you can pull some of the yarn from the stitches to either side to make it a little bigger. So I've put that yarn over on my needle, and now I can purl it and continue across the row. I've almost finished the final repeat of my little sample here, which is going to turn into a little washcloth. I think it's a nice size for that. But I wanted to share a few more tips about reading your lace. You can see that from the pattern how it looks. We've got that decrease line and our yarn overs creating that shape, and you can see that repeated here in the lace itself. And that's where reading your knitting comes in. You can see you're supposed to have 4 yarn overs on each side, so you can count and see where they are. They sort of stack up diagonally on top of each other. So that's something you can use to reference as you're knitting, and I'll show you what I mean as I work this final row. I'm on row 7. Okay, so here I have to knit 4, and if I look at this, I can see my final knit for the row should be above the yarn over for the last lace row, and there's that yarn over. That's my knit 4. That's one way to keep track, because they always stack up diagonally. You're knitting 1 more stitch each time, so the last stitch you knit on that next row will be the yarn over created 2 rows before. And your decreases will always stack up as well. You can see the slanted line right there that leans to the left. They all stack up on top of each other all the way through. So these are the 3 stitches involved in that decrease. This stitch over here is the one that's going to provide the slant, and those are the 2 that'll be worked together. So that stitch that's providing the slant will always be the stitch that's just to the right of those decrease lines. So it's important to read your knitting, and you can start seeing these patterns as you knit in those decrease lines and in your yarn overs. And there is the yarn over from the row before, and I know I'm going to have to knit that, so my yarn over goes right here. And then I knit 3. And the first stitch I'm knitting on this side is that yarn over from the previous row. Those are just a few small things to look at. It's important to really look at what's happening on your needles, compare it to your chart or your written instructions, and you can look at your lace and you can follow that as your guideline, and you'll know that you're working in the right place and you haven't offset the pattern somehow. So I finished my lace repeats, and now I'm ready to finish with the border. We're going to work 5 rows as follows: slipping that first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, knitting to the end of the row. Do that 5 times, but on that first row I can remove all of my markers. Now once you've finished your final 5 rows of garter stitch edgings, you're going to bind off your stitches just with a regular bind off. Knit the first 2 stitches, pull the first one over the second one. That's all there is to it. Try to do this a bit loosely because you might want to stretch out your dishcloth a bit to show off that lace. So continue that across the row to the last stitch, and then we'll weave in our ends using duplicate stitch. So we turn to the wrong side of the work, and we're going to use a method called duplicate stitch. You're just going to follow the path of a stitch. A stitch is just a loop, that goes up and down and around and up and down and around, just like that. So I'm just going to follow that path. Pick a spot to start. Doesn't really matter. I think I will start right here. So you're going up. Look for basically the smiles and the frowns, and you're going to move in between those. Those are the heads of the stitches, and we're going to use them to catch and hold our yarn. So I came up through a frown, and now I'm going to go up through a smile. And I'm looking at the path of this stitch right here and how it's caught in the heads of those stitches and around it. So that's where I'm going to go. This stitch is going this way, down through here, this smile, and then over this way through that frown. And by working duplicate stitch, it really tightens them in quite well. And the stitch goes this way, up there, through there. It holds it in place and it hides it on the other side, so it won't peek through, which is really important, especially if you're using a second color. But you can't see where we're weaving in the ends right there. And it holds it in very well. I've never had an issue with duplicate stitch coming out. I do tend to leave a bit of a long tail, so the first time it's washed or blocked, I can make sure that it has plenty of room and then snip that final tail off. But I always weave in my ends before I wash it, because that will give these stitches their final hold. Basically, they'll hold their shape even better. That should be enough to hold. This is cotton, so I go a little bit further because cotton can be a bit slippery. There, I've got one more to weave in. You don't have to watch me do that. So there's a finished sample. This is really a cute size for a little tiny washcloth. I don't have this in the pattern instructions, but if you want to work this, cast on 27 stitches. That will give you your border stitches and enough for the repeat of each pattern, plus that one extra edge stitch over here to balance the pattern. You'll work 2 multiples of the pattern, and you'll work at 3 repeats of the pattern to get this little dishcloth. So there you have it. You finished your lace dish towel. From casting on to binding off, weaving in your ends. You've learned how to read a lace chart and work a double decrease that you'll commonly see in lace patterns. For even more knitting tutorials, check out this playlist that I've linked right here, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.